Part of my bio is that my wife and I live on our family's 7-generation ranch. My great grandfather moved to moved to the Texas Hill Country in 1851, and I'm the newcomer. My wife's family was already here. Uh, I've been a professional photographer my whole life, except for the couple of months that I took to serve as an interim CEO for the Texas Wildlife Association in 1989, which turned into a now 35-year stint, although I don't have any official duties anymore. I'm an honorary deal. This is a campfire story. We were sitting around the ranch around a campfire. I would tell this story about how all this came about. I've been on Zooms before, but I've only been a participant. So I'll try to do my best as a presenter, but it's my first time. In the fall of 1988, there were 3 people sitting around a board table, which was a borrowed dining room table at the time at the Texas Wildlife Association headquarters. Garner Fuller, now deceased, who is a certified wildlife biologist. Those of you at the Texas chapter understand that. Steve Lewis, who is now the chairman of Jefferson Bank in San Antonio, and myself. Garner Fuller made a comment, wouldn't it be nice if you got the same if you paid the same taxes for raising deer, the same as if you raise goats. So that's where all of this started. About the same time, there were three biologists. There's 2 over there in Far East Texas, Parks and Wildlife biologists, Kay Fleming and Carl Frentress, as well as Bob Carroll over in the Blackland prairies. And they started asking questions of the East Texas state representative at the time, Clyde Alexander, and remember that name, Clyde Alexander. And they began talking to legislators at the same time the Texas Wildlife Association started talking to legislators about doing something about tax breaks for taking care of wildlife species, just like if you took care of grazing species, agricultural species. In January, time passed a little bit. In January of 1991, 2 of us went and called on the then Speaker of the Texas House, Gib Lewis, who was a rancher. In addition to a businessman, he as a matter of fact, he just put a conservation easement on that ranch. And we proposed that idea to him. He picks up the phone and calls Representative Hugo Berlanga from Corpus Christi, who was the chairman of the Calendars Committee in 1991. And we all trot down to the Legislative Counsel's office and a day or 2 later and watch as a young man actually in the Leg Counsel's office sits there and drafts a piece of legislation. And that young man is now the mayor of Austin, Texas. Anyway, the very first conversations we have, there were 3 things that we were adamant about. The first was, this is 1991, and it was named the Robin Hood session of the legislature, because that's how the state figured out how they were going to attempt to pay for public education in Texas. So the very first thing that had to happen was this notion had to be revenue neutral. Also, you had to be active participants. You could not hang a hummingbird feeder and move to the Cayman Islands and receive a special valuation. And the third thing it had to be for all species of wildlife, not just the hunted game species, but all species of wildlife. So Representative Berlanga, chairman of the House Calendars Committee, and Senator Bill Sims at the time, another rancher who was from San Angelo, they introduced in the House, Berlanga, and in the Senate, Bill Sims, House Bill 1298. To everyone's amazement, House Bill 1298 passes. However, it's still not over, even when it passes, because it has to go to the governor for signature. The governor at the time was Governor Ann Richards, and the governor has a certain amount of time to either sign or veto a piece of legislation, or if the clock runs out, it becomes law without signature. At about 15 minutes before midnight, about 11 o'clock before the midnight uh, deadline, a phone call was put into Governor Richards' office, and the discovery was made that it was in the veto stack. She was going to still show up and veto all the bills that were in the veto stack. So a conversation was had with the lawyer in that office. And I gave a little history and how it came about very quickly, and the same three promises were made: active management, revenue neutral, and it was for all species of wildlife. That lawyer got up and pulled the bill out of the veto stack and put it in the become law without signature stack. So House Bill 1298 was approved by the legislature. Now, in 1992, the Property Tax Board, which is the predecessor for all of the your property taxes, ran into some problems over there. So they asked the Attorney General for an opinion, and the Attorney General was going to declare it unconstitutional because the Property Tax Board, if you can believe this, the Property Tax Board recommended that all of those wildlife species that you would receive a special valuation for, you had to eat. I don't believe anybody knows to this day how a black-cap vireo tastes, but that was not the purpose of the bill. So all things in 92 pointed towards an unfavorable opinion from the Attorney General. So Gib Lewis, former speaker now at that time, and who is a consultant to Texas Wildlife Association at the time, asked the Attorney General not to issue that opinion, that we would fix the bill in the next session, which the next session then turns out to be 95. We missed the deadline to do anything in 93. So in 95, the fix to the constitutional issue, and it turns out there could only be one fix. We'd have to pass a constitutional amendment. The problem with changing the tax code to accommodate a wildlife management valuation was unfixable in the legislature because of the Texas Constitution. So we had to pass a constitutional amendment. Representative Clyde Alexander, there's that name, and Senator John Monfort from Lubbock introduced House Bill 1358 in 1995, which authorized being placed before the voters to make sure that this was constitutional. To everyone's amazement, again, it passes, and it would not have passed had some very terrific language been presented to kind of save the whole process by Kirby Brown, who then was with the Parks and Wildlife Department. He offered some language that was then substituted into the bill, and it passed. Same three promises were made all along to everybody. Revenue neutral. They're always looking for money at the Texas legislature. Active management, and for all species of wildlife. It passes the House and the Senate. Imagine that, what happens next? It runs into some unexpected problems. We thought we had it fixed in the governor's office. And this time the governor is George W. Bush. So we had to go talk to the governor's office again. Same three promises made to the governor's offices: revenue neutral, active, all species. This time it was actually signed, and we had a big signing ceremony and had pictures made, and you'll have some of those in the handouts that you have links to. But we still had to go before the voters. They draw for places on the ballot. This was, I think, second from the last. It was Proposition 11 in 1995. And generally, people are tired of dealing with constitutional amendments before you ever start. And by the time you get to the last one on the ballot, it's generally heck with this, let's just vote against it. So we got together what those of us who were on it began to call the Proposition 11 World Tour. We went to all of the major media outlets in Texas, all the editorial boards in Texas, and we promised in front of microphones and in op-eds, we've made the same three promises: revenue neutral, active management, and for all species. That trip was kind of fun. We called it the Proposition 11 World Tour because we felt like we were rock stars. Everywhere we went, they turned lights on and stuck microphones in front of us. It went to the voters in 1995, and it passed 62 to 38. That's pretty good skunking, no matter what kind of score, what kind of game you're playing. The support for this notion, which we kind of in the trade refer to Proposition 11, is very broad. I mean, here's a abbreviated list of the supporters of this, which remain so today, and the list has only grown. The governor's office, the lieutenant governor's office, the speaker's office, Texas Wildlife Association, Cattle Raisers Association, Sierra Club, Audubon Society, Farm Bureau, Nature Conservancy, Sportsmen's Conservationists of Texas, Sheep and Goat Raisers Association, Exotic Wildlife Association, Davis Mountains Trans-Pecos Heritage Association, Riverside and Landowners Protection Coalition, Environmental Defense, National Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited, Quail Unlimited, National Wild Turkey Federation, Texas Bighorn Society, all the wildlife management co-ops all over the state, Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society, the Wildlife Society, and on and on. This is a very popular notion, and it is constitutionally afforded. It's in the Constitution of the Texas. So we thought we were in really good shape, but unfortunately, the work still continues. What happened when you institute legislation is it's got to work for a while before you start realizing what's happening. Well, guess what? People started cheating on it right away. And from all ends of the spectrum, you had developers who were using it to bank development properties and not doing any practices at all. And you, in fact, did have people, in effect, putting hummingbird feeder up and moving to Costa Rica and still claiming that they were doing something for wildlife. So we had to fix both ends of that spectrum where the abuses were. So we went before the legislature again with a fix to those problems. And that was House Bill 3123 in 2001, sponsored by Representative Clyde Alexander, there's the name again, and Senator Buster Brown in the Senate. One more time, we go to everybody over there in that pink building in downtown Austin and promise the same three things: revenue neutral, active management, and all species of wildlife. House Bill 3123 passes and is signed, so it is the law. And what it enabled was that the Parks and Wildlife Department and the Comptroller's Office, they would write guidelines which have been in force for several terms, but guidelines are guidelines. There's no force of law, in effect, behind guidelines. But the comptroller then took those guidelines and made them rules. So the people who administer property taxes in the state of Texas now have rules, and the rules are equivalent to law, as I understand it. I'm not a lawyer. But now, if you are denied this special valuation and are doing everything right, if you go to court, you'll probably win. It'll still cost you. But most of the appraisal districts up till now have been fairly reasonable with applying this valuation. Now, this session that's coming up, everyone's different. You know, there are three things that are going to just hammer this session of the legislature that's getting ready to start. Of course, the pandemic is first and foremost, which has caused a budget crunch. There's always a budget problem, but this time it's severe. So you have the budget issues. And then it's the 10th year, so it's the redistricting process. So you have COVID, the budget problems, and the fight over who's going to be serving in the next Texas legislature, out of which counties and which areas, and that fight is happening. So most of the oxygen in that building is going to be taken up by those three issues, which means that there is an increased, believe it or not, there's an increased jeopardy for mischief. People can slide things in the middle of the night and nobody's paying attention because they're focused on those big three items. So we really have to be careful. But right now, we think everything is okay because it is constitutional and it is law. I'll talk briefly about the handout. That's how it all became, how it got to where it is, and the challenges that are still ahead. I'll briefly go through these handouts that you already have. The first one is a statement of what is actually in the code about what an exemption really is, and then what a special use valuation is, which is what the wildlife valuation is. That's really important for everybody to recall. I'm flipping through these. I'm sorry, because you will have them all. There's letters in here. There's a letter from the chairman of the Parks and Wildlife Commission, Catherine Idsall, who's now Catherine Love, to the comptroller at that time. This letter still stands. And it right there at the first sentence of the fourth paragraph, revenue neutrality continues to be a focus of legislative intent. Then there are some quotes from the sponsors of the legislation. One I want to point out is that from Representative Bob Turner, furthermore, the sole test for receiving this special tax valuation is how the land is being used and not who owns it. So this is about the land and taking care of the land. It doesn't matter whether you're a corporation, a private individual, Republican, Democrat, whatever. It's how you treat the land that generates the tax valuation. Senator John Montfort, who was a Senate sponsor of the second bill, here's a quote from him. "That piece of legislation represents one of my proudest moments in my service in the legislature." Senator Montfort went on to be the president of Texas Tech and the chairman of AT&T. And he and Clyde Alexander are still in touch with me every so often, and I still have their private cell phone numbers, and I'm instructed by both Clyde Alexander and John Montfort that if anybody, quote unquote, messes with their bill, I'm supposed to let them know. And I'll be tickled to death for that cavalry to come to our rescue, but I hope that never happens. There's a fact sheet in there generated by me that I use to hand out to the legislature about what it is and what it really isn't. And then I used to write a column in the Texas Wildlife Association magazine called Along the Back Sendero, and there is the fleshing out of that handout. And there's a full story of our newsletter at the time about the Proposition 11 journey. There's a handout in there about, I'll show you what it looks like. I don't know if you can see a few public benefits of private lands. And, you know, the general public and the general media do not understand that all these things come from your efforts, not just habitat for birds or white-tailed deer or whatever, but it's recreation, aesthetics, food, fiber, shelter, energy, timber, aquifer recharge and infiltration, runoff reduction, carbon sequestration, control of erosion, fish and wildlife habitat, habitat for threatened and endangered species, on and on and on and on and on. The soundbite is those bluebonnets don't blow out there, don't grow out there on that asphalt. They grow based on your efforts. There's an article in here from Lessons in Leopold written by Steve Nelly will help you design your thinking about how you should feel about this. There's one thing that's not in here. I'll have to send this to you again, Ben. I don't know if everybody can see this. It is a picture. And normally now, part of my closing, I ask you what you see. And about half the class is going to say they see a rabbit. About the other half of the class is going to say they see a duck. I had one person say one time it looks like the handle of a corkscrew. Another person says it looks like the handle on a cane. And the point being is a quote from an ISNN, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So please see this wildlife management valuation for what it is. It's supposed to be, and it is, a way for us to take care of the natural resources. And in return for that, we receive a special valuation. Now, I've got one more thing, Ben. I promise I'll close it up quick. It's my soapbox that they allow me to be on once a year. And it's also in there. It's another one of my columns along the back Sendero. And it's about the true value of open spaces. And the point is, how do we as a society value land? Well, I'll tell you how we value it. I've got it listed in here. We value it by location, and it's actually location, location, location. Comparables, access, condition, terms, production. but production potential, investment potential, development potential. That's how we value land. We value it to sell. We don't value land to keep. This society only believes that land is valued to sell it, that none of us on this call can wait. We're jumping at an opportunity to sell it for the best price we can get at the drop of a hat. That's what the general public thinks. We don't value land to keep. We only value it to sell. So please help those of us who try to do this as often as we are find an opportunity to do so. Look at that chart of the value of open spaces and try to convince people not to value it for what it will bring on the market, but the value for what it will be to keep it, and to keep it as you want to keep it, providing all of those benefits for free. Think about that. All those benefits listed on that chart that you have in your handouts, we landowners provide them for free. Where is the 60 Minutes crew to talk about that part of our society? And that's all my part. Thank you again. I appreciate it.